হ্যালো। হ্যালো। হ্যালো অপর্ণা, কেমন আছো? অপর্ণা শুনতে পাচ্ছ?
শুনতে পাচ্ছি।
হ্যাঁ, ভালো আছো?
দিদি,
হ্যাঁ, ভালো
হ্যাঁ
আছো?
শুনতে পাচ্ছি।
আচ্ছা আচ্ছা, ভালো আছো তো?
হ্যাঁ ভালো আছি, তুমি ভালো
আ-
আছো?
হ্যাঁ, আছি আছো। আছি, ঠিক আছে তো। আচ্ছা।
হ্যাঁ, কালকে প্রথমে তো তোমাকে শোনা যাচ্ছিল, তারপরে শেষে শুনলাম।
মানে ওই খালি না ঘুরে যাচ্ছে ওটা। মানে
ও,
খুব প্রবলেম হয়েছিল, বোঝাই যাচ্ছে।
হুম 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 হুম।
ঠিক আছে। আর তাহলে কালকেও আমি 3:45 নাগাদ ঢুকে গেছিলাম।
হ্যাঁ,
তারপরে যাই হোক, ম্যাডামের মানে একটুখানি শুরু হওয়ার পর থেকে আমি শুনতে পেরেছি, তখন আমি ঢুকতে পারলাম, মানে পুরো জাস্ট
আচ্ছা,
ঘুরে।
কিন্তু এখনো খুব আসছে, কিন্তু তুমি কি আমার আসতে শুনতে পাচ্ছ না জোরে?
আমি তোমারটাও আসতে শুনছি। আমি তো
আচ্ছা,
এখন আসতে কথা বলছি, এখন তো তোমার সাথে কথা বলছি। তাছাড়া
কিন্তু আমি খুব আসতে শুনছি, দাঁড়াও।
আচ্ছা,
এটা কি একটু জোরে হলো?
এটা একটু জোরে
হ্যালো?
হলো।
হ্যাঁ
একটু
হ্যাঁ
জোরে।
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ। যেন আমার এই কর্ডটা ভালো করে লাগেনি। ঠিক আছে, এখন লেগেছে।
আচ্ছা আচ্ছা, হ্যাঁ
হুম,
এখন আর
এখন
আমার ভয়েস
শোনা যাচ্ছে।
খুব
এখন
আসছে।
অনেক ইমপ্রুভ করে। হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, খুব ভালো শুনতে পাই।
তোমার সঙ্গে শুধু কথা বলতে
না না
ঠিক
না
আছে।
না, ওই সাউন্ডটা একটু। হ্যাঁ,
আচ্ছা,
ঠিক আছে। হুম।
হ্যালো পূর্ণাদি।
হ্যাঁ, কে গো?
মহুয়া।
ম- মহুয়া, আরে তোকে দেখতে চাই।
এই আমাকে
তুই একটু ভিডিও অন কর।
এই দেখো ভিডিও অনই আছে, দেখো তো।
ওই তো মহুয়া,
দাঁড়া, এই তো।
সেদিন আমরা একে অপরকে দেখি না, তাই
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ
দেখতে পাচ্ছ আমাকে?
হ্যাঁ,
তো?
দেখতে পাচ্ছি দেখতে পাচ্ছি।
আচ্ছা আচ্ছা আচ্ছা, ওকে ওকে। ভালো
খুব
আছো তো?
মজা হচ্ছে। হ্যাঁ, ভালো আছি রে, তুই ভালো আছিস?
হ্যাঁ গো, এমনি সব
শরীর
ঠিক আছে।
শরীর টরীর ভালো? হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ,
হ্যাঁ
ঠিক
হ্যাঁ
আছে
হ্যাঁ,
ঠিক আছে।
ঠিক আছে, হ্যাঁ
হুম হুম
ওকে।
হুম
হ্যাঁ।
হুম। হ্যাঁ, একটা মিষ্টি দেবে? কি দেবে? চেষ্টা
Hello. All participants are requested to please switch off their cameras. All participants, please switch off your cameras and your microphones. Participants. All part all participants, please switch off your cameras. ও আবার ও বাবা ঠিক আছে আমি দেখছি আমি রিচাকে বলছি কি ঝামেলা এই ইয়েকে নিয়ে না
কি
না
হলো পর্ণাদি? পর্ণাদি শুনতে পাচ্ছো?
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ শুনতে পাচ্ছি অপর্ণা হ্যাঁ আচ্ছা ইজ রিচা হিয়ার রিচা রিচা প্রিন্সিপাল ম্যাডাম ঢুকতে পারছেন না প্লিজ অ্যালাউ হার টু জয়েন জয়েন করেছেন ওকে
now 4. Shall I start?
Yes, please.
Okay. At the outset, may I first request all of you to switch off your microphones and cameras. A very good evening to everybody. On behalf of Lady Brabham College, I welcome you all to the second day of the 2-day webinar on women's studies. The theme of this webinar is Her Story, Women's Movements in India. This is organized by the Advanced Research Center for Indian Writing in English in collaboration with the Women's Studies Center of Lady Brabham College. As you all know, we have 2 eminent speakers in this webinar. Professor Shivli Sarkar, Professor of Political Science and Principal, Lady Brabham College, and Dr. Aparna Bandyopadhyay, Associate Professor of History, Diamond Harbour Women's University. Both of them are authorities on women's studies, and we are extremely delighted to have them in this webinar. Yesterday, that is on the day number 1 of the webinar, Professor Shivli Sarkar, an author of 7 books and numerous research papers and recipient of Shiksha Ratna 2017, made an excellent presentation on women's movement in India, past and present. She has analyzed the evolution of the feminist movement in India from the 19th century to the present day, from the days of Savitribai Phule and Tarabai Shinde to Matangini Hajra and Aruna Asaf Ali, from Sarojini Naidu to Medha Patkar, and even women of more recent days. She has rightly observed that women's movement in India has gradually widened its scope and it is gaining a pluralistic character. She has stressed on this point. The pluralistic character involving political, economic, social, environmental, and cultural issues. It has a definite purpose and ideology and a program. On behalf of Lady Brabham College, on behalf of the organizers, I express heartfelt thanks to Professor Shivli Sarkar for her brilliant speech. Our second speaker, that is today's speaker, is Dr. Aparna Bandyopadhyay, Associate Professor of History, Diamond Harbour Women's University. She is another authority on the subject. She was formerly in West Bengal Educational Service and served several government colleges, including Lady Brabham College. Her book, Desire and Defiance, a study of Bengali women in love, based on her doctoral dissertation, was published in 2016. She has co-edited 2 anthologies on women's studies. She completed a UGC research project on a leisure of women's own television mega serials and Bengali women in contemporary Kolkata. She is currently co-editing a book entitled Her Story in honor of Professor Geraldine Ford. She has presented papers in many national and international conferences and contributed articles to several journals and editors' volumes. All these clearly show how women's question, how feminism has gained currency in academic circles in India. And it is not without reason that it is now included in the newly framed CBCS syllabus in English, history, and other disciplines. I extend a warm welcome to Dr. Apurna Bandyopadhyay. In fact, this is her homecoming. I earnestly request her to give her presentation. She will speak on, was there a feminist movement in colonial India? Over to Dr. Apurna Bandyopadhyay.
Thank you, Dr. Joyashree Mukherjee. Yes, indeed, this is my homecoming. Brabourne was my second home and it still is. I had served at Lady Brabourne College from 2011 to 2016, and those years at Lady Brabourne College were the most fulfilling years of my life, fulfilling both academically, intellectually, and emotionally. At Lady Brabourne, I got so many friends, and the friendship continues with my former colleagues. Uh, Dr. Porna Ghosh, she is the director, the coordinator of the Women's Studies Center of Lady Brabourne College. I regard her as my friend, of course, my friend, and also my mentor, my philosopher and guide. Dr. Joyashree Mukherjee, she has always been by my side. I mean, I started my career in 2000, I mean, not 2000, in 1996. And since 1996, I've been working with Joyashree off and on in different government colleges. And as you know, that some bonds are forever. I mean, some bonds persist till death. And my bonds with my colleagues at Lady Brabourne College, they will last till my last day. I'm sure of that. And no words are adequate enough to thank Professor Dr. Shuli Sarkar. Yes, she's the principal of the college. That is her official designation. But she's a wonderful lady. I mean, she's such a good-hearted person at heart. Such a big heart she has, and she really has been my pillar of support since 2011, the year I joined Lady Brabourne College. I can never thank her enough. She is my guide, my inspiration, my lodestar. Yes, I become very, very emotional every time I talk of her, every time I talk of my colleagues at Lady Brabourne College and the college itself, and of course the Women's Studies Center. I had been with this center since I joined. The center was established in 2010, and I joined the next year. And from the beginning, I was involved in its various activities. And it's really, the center is my second child, almost my second child. I really miss those days at Lady Brabourne College, the golden time I had at Lady Brabourne College. Now let me go back to the main theme of this webinar. Her Story, Women's Movements in India. This is a two-day webinar. The first lecture was delivered yesterday by Professor Dr. Shuli Sarkar. Yes, it was a brilliant presentation, and I got so much to know. I mean, so much I didn't know before I heard her. There was so much that I learned from her. And I've tried to incorporate her insights, some of her perspectives in my lecture today. Today I'll be speaking on, was there a feminist movement in colonial India? Yes, I put a question mark before after the topic, at the end of the topic, because this is a controversial topic. This is a subject of controversy, and my own position in this regard will gradually unfold. It will unfold in the course of my lecture. Now, before I engage with this question, that is, was there a feminist movement in colonial India? Let me briefly discuss the trajectories of the feminist movement in the West. Now, Western feminist scholars have classified the feminist movement, as we all know, into a series of waves. In the 19th century, women in the white world began to press for their right to education, property, and employment. They began to demand the right to vote in various representative institutions. This movement for rights and the belief that the legal award of these rights by the state would solve women's problems entirely has been described by later day feminists as the first wave of feminism. A few men, such as John Stuart Mill, also joined the movement. But the second wave of feminism is supposed to have begun in the 1960s in the USA. Radical feminism, the dominant strand of the second wave, harped on the all-pervasiveness of patriarchy, on its insidious presence both in the realms of the public and the private, the patriarchal control on women's sexuality, alongside demands for legal interventions to ensure right to abortion, right to equal pay, etc. Both the liberal feminists and the radical feminists pretended to talk about the oppression of all women, while they were actually talking about the problems of white women in the USA and the UK. They not only excluded black women of these countries, but also women of the non-white world from their purview. As scholars of women's studies or women's history located in India, a country that has for 2 centuries been under the throes of British colonial domination, we have been trained and indoctrinated in Western knowledge systems that continue to be the bedrock of the educational system in post-colonial India. Our understanding of feminism, of its different ways, our knowledge of the origins, the changing goals and methods of the feminist movement have all been derived from Western scholarship. Initially, Western feminists would refuse to acknowledge that women in the non-Western world could possess a feminist consciousness. In the introduction to her book titled Feminism, The Essential Historical Writings, Mariam Sher wrote, "No feminist works emerge from behind the Hindu Parda or out of the Muslim harems. Centuries of slavery do not provide a fertile ground for intellectual development or expression." Such notions have been challenged by Geraldine Fox, a pioneer of women's studies and women's history in India. She writes in her 1982 essay, Caged Tigers, First Wave Feminists in India, that if we agree on a straightforward definition of feminism as a set of doctrines on the place of women in society and on the extent to which women should have equal rights, opportunities, and responsibilities with those of men, then feminism existed in India. Indian women wrote and spoke about women's conditions, formed organizations to secure desired changes, and eventually had an impact on the institutions of their society. Moreover, like their Western sisters, their concerns during the first phase of feminism, that is from the 1880s to the 1940s, were the political and legal superstructure. And their most notable reforms were in the areas of suffrage, education, and legal and civil rights. Indian feminists were not carbon copies of Western feminists in either ideology or goal. India was under British rule, its economy was subordinated to British needs, and the Indian social system bore little resemblance to that of Western nations. Despite these differences, feminism did emerge from behind the parda. Forbes highlights the organizational contributions of feminists such as Sarala Devi Chaudhurani, Sarojini Naidu, and others. Subsequently, in Women in Modern India, Geraldine Forbes proceeds proceeded to more elaborately discuss Indian women's struggles for reform in the areas of suffrage, education, and political, legal rights, civil rights, and their efforts to form associations for winning their rights and fulfilling their political goals in the pre-independence decades. Some historians have noticed regional disparities in the level of feminist consciousness manifested by Indian women in the colonial era. Meredith Borthwick, in her very path-breaking book, Women, Meredith Borthwick, the name of her book. Okay, I'll tell the name of the book later. Yes, it's no. This is her article actually looking at women's history, 19th century Bengal. Okay, and yes, and she has a very famous book on Bengal in the colonial period from 1849 to 1905, and this is a must for those who are doing women's history of this period. Now, Podda Anagol Gill, another famous historian, the historian of women, has noticed an extraordinary level of agency among Maharashtrian women, manifested in their assertion of right to property and livelihood, to profession and mobility, the rebellion of wives and the legal action they took against marital justice. She also demonstrates how literary women such as Tarabai Shinde, Pandita Ramabai, and others created a patriarchal counter discourse and how they participated in the Age of Consent debates in 1891. Shomita Sen, another very great name in the field of women's studies and women's history, she points out in the introduction to her edited volume, Mapping the Field, that an autonomous or a new women's movement began in India in the mid-1970s. Indian scholars who went to the West for higher studies gained exposure to radical feminist thought, which had surfaced in the USA in the 1960s, and also to debates around women's development triggered by the United Nations organization's growing concern with the women's question. The United Nations persuaded the Indian government to undertake a fact-finding mission with respect to the conditions of Indian women. The Committee for the Status of Women in India, constituted in 1971 for this purpose, published its report in 1975, the very year which marked the starting point of the UN Decade for Women. The Towards Equality report revealed that the status of Indian women had barely improved since 1947. In fact, women lagged behind in all yardsticks of progress, busting the myth of equality engendered by the Indian Constitution. The Indian nation, as Rafa Rai points out in her introduction to the Handbook of Gender, that the Indian nation had clearly failed its women. The report was a turning point as it triggered the birth of women's studies, women's history, and the autonomous women's movement in India. The three journeys proceeded in tandem, buttressed, and spoke to each other. They were facilitated by engagements with the women's question at the international level under the aegis of the UN, reflected in a series of conferences on women in different parts of the world. Shomita Sen points out that the new women's movement of the 1970s was preceded by an earlier phase which she describes as the first feminist movement. She further divides the first feminist movement into two phases. The earlier phase was the phase of male-led social reform intended for the betterment of women's lives. Women-oriented reformism involved movements for legal interventions by the colonial state, initiatives to spread education among women, awareness campaigns on issues like child marriage, polygamy, etc. Despite its unquestionable benefits for women, the reformist enterprise was mired in patriarchal mindset. For instance, women's education was advocated to make them better wives, better mothers, and homemakers. There was a subtle reworking of the patriarchal attempt to control women's sexuality in, for instance, the Hindu Widows Remarriage Act of 1856 and the Age of Consent Act of 1891. Nevertheless, social reform, especially the Women's Education Project, initiated an irreversible process of awakening of women's intellects and sensibilities. Women began to think, to question, criticize, and condemn, and they engaged in all these processes by taking up the pen. The new women, Sunrise, began to speak out from the 1880s, questioning elements of their subordination. They found a voice in writing about their lives and the conditions of women. According to Sen, the 1920s and 1930s witnessed the peak of what we can call the first feminist movement in India. In this period, women stepped out into the public domain, entered the various strands of nationalist politics, participated in public debates, formed organizations with the twin agenda of serving the nationalist cause and bettering the lives of women. She takes care to point out, however, that participation in nationalist politics did not necessarily signal a feminist consciousness per se, not per se signal a feminist consciousness. Most women were concerned about women's problems, but most women who were concerned about women's problems chose to suppress their grievances and give precedence to the struggle for the country's freedom. Sharla Devi Chaudhurani was an exception in this regard. In 1931, she pressed for a separate women's congress because the National Congress was not interested in women's issues. It was not showing adequate interest in women's issues. However, her initiative failed on account of lack of support. The organizations founded by women in this period were all clones of organizations formed and led by men. They had the same structure and goals. These organizations, like those formed by men, prioritized their commitment towards achieving the independence of the nation and relegated all other issues to the sideline, including the women's issues related to women. While appreciating women's increasingly vocal and active role in the public domain, I would argue that Bengali women's initial expressions of feminist consciousness were literary. They scripted their protest against patriarchal norms and articulated them on print. Yes, Shivlidi, yesterday I had spoken about a literary movement initiated by women. And yes, I would discuss the same, the literary movement, how women use literature as a mode of resistance to patriarchy. Now, if we define feminism as an awareness that the relationship between men and women are unequal, and that this inequality should be removed, then many women of this time were indeed feminists, and their feminist consciousness was aptly revealed in their writing. The development of print technology, the development of Bengali prose, combined with the spread of education among women over the course of the 19th century, have enabled the emergence of the category of the Lekhika, or the woman writer, even earlier than Shomita Sen had supposed. According to Tonika Sarkar, around the middle of the 19th century, a social category was born in Bengal along with a new word that named it, Lekhika, the female author. Women wrote letters and essays in newspapers and periodicals. They penned self-revelatory prose such as memoirs and autobiographies, wrote travelogues, published polemical and didactic manuals and treatises, and finally they authored novels, short stories, plays, and poems. And by taking up the pen in these various genres, they forged a unique relationship with the words and created a bridge between the home and the world. Apart from Hindu and Brahmo women, Muslim women also began to express themselves in print in this period. Now let us try to retrieve some of these voices of protest from colonial Bengal. As early as 1835, a few elderly Kulin maidens of Shantipur in Bengal appealed to the rulers of the country to frame laws forbidding respectable men from taking mistresses and redressing the double standards of Hindu society in this regard. They asked whether the Shastras were formulated only to deny women the pleasures of life. A week later, that is in 1835 itself, a few women of Chinsura furnished a charter of demands which included the right to choose their own husbands, abolition of polygamy, and the right of remarriage of widows. Now, their letters have been compiled in Brojendranath Bandyopadhyay edited Sangbadpatre Shekele Kotha. On 5th December 1869, a widow, in a letter addressed to Queen Victoria, described the agonies of her unfulfilled existence. She recounted how, with the onset of youth, she was overpowered by desire, and though she tried for some time to protect her chastity, she eventually became emotionally and sexually involved with a man, thus tainting the honor of her family. She became pregnant and had to take the very painful step of abortion. She attributed her predicament to the stubborn refusal of society to allow the remarriage of widows, even after its legalization, and she appealed to the Queen to implement the law in this regard. Okay. In 1871, a Kulin woman named Kusum Kamini, in some documents she's also referred to as Kusum Kumari, Kusum Kamini, alias Kusum Kumari Devi, claimed that her marriage contracted to an old man in her infancy was not valid as it was not based on her consent, and she appealed